brace yourself for more blackouts.
There's been a major transformer leak. PG&E tells us someone may have fired some shots into that transformer.
As Texas gets hit with record heat, the state's power grid can't keep up.
They're working very hard to restore full power, but at this point, there is no definitive timetable.
Some getting flashbacks to the deadly cold wave in 2021 that collapsed the electric grid and resulted in at least 246 deaths.
I bet you've heard that our grid needs an upgrade. But I'd equally bet that the majority of people, myself included, don't have the faintest idea of how the grid actually works. We just assume when we're cold and we turn on the heat that our furnace kicks in and we just get a bill at the end of the month. But as technologies like AI heat up, so too does their demand for power. And this trend happens to coincide with several others, including the rise of intermittent renewable sources, the increasing bloat in the approval process for new grid infrastructure, supply chain delays exceeding 12 months, and a whole lot more. All of these things make for the fact that our grid relying on outdated technology, in some cases from over a century ago, something of a national emergency. And that's why we brought in A16Z American Dynamism partner, Ryan McEntush, to break down how all this actually works. So in this explainer, we'll dive into the grid's increasing complexity, what's broken and how we got here, how technologies like solar, batteries, natural gas, and nuclear might play a role in this future, and why solving these problems is essential in allowing our economy, but also our country's technological dominance, to thrive. As a reminder, the content here is for informational purposes only, should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investors or potential investors in any A16Z fund. Please note that A16Z and its affiliates may also maintain investments in the companies discussed in this podcast. For more details, including a link to our investments, please see a16z.com/disclosures. All right, let's kick things off. Maybe an obvious question for some listeners, but why does our grid even need a refresh? And why do some people believe that this might actually be one of the most important issues for our country to address?
The grid supports all really energy transfer or industrial capacity in our country. There's this assumption that when you turn on the light switch, the lights are just going to turn on. But behind that, there's a lot of industrial processes, both in the power generation and moving that power around. And for the last, couple decades, we really haven't seen a growth in energy demand. So the grid has sort of not really changed that much. But increasingly over the last 20 years, and especially with the increase in data center AI, we're seeing the grid change a lot. Increasingly, people are seeing the effects of that. We have an increase in outages, a lot of this weather-related. The price of electricity is now a lot more volatile. And I think people are becoming more aware of not only sort of the climate-related effects of energy, but how it affects their daily lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned some of these new technologies. We're talking electric vehicles, we're talking about AI and data centers. But what is that gap really? If we look ahead, are we super far behind the energy requirement that we'll need, or are we actually pretty close?
All the projections seem to indicate a huge gap. A lot of the current world is powered by things like fossil fuels, like your car, you fill up with gasoline. That's likely going to increasingly shift as more people adopt electric vehicles. A lot of the things in our home, you look at thermostats, heating with some of these heat pumps. You look at new induction stoves. Every single device now has a battery, it's connected to the internet. So we were seeing huge demand there. And then also on the industrial side, we're seeing a lot of processes that were previously using fossil fuels as inputs, now increasingly using electricity. Another good example is data centers, as you noted. These regions where a lot of these data centers are located are expecting huge growth in energy demand, to the point now that some large hyperscalers are looking at things like nuclear to support and make sure that the data centers stay online in periods of lower reliability or price volatility. So this is a huge concern a lot of people are paying attention to.
I mean, to your point earlier, we just kind of assume when we flick the light switch on that the lights turn on and that we get this electricity, not just sometimes, but all the time. And so let's just quickly discuss how the grid actually works. What is it composed of? And how do each of those components contribute to electricity actually being generated, but then also transmitted and distributed to all of our homes?
Sure. So I think the most important idea is that The electric grid is not some sort of monolithic entity that is the same across the United States. It's actually made up of three sort of major interconnections. The grid is made up of AC or alternating current, but between these interconnections, they're a different phase, which means that you can't directly connect these interconnections. And they're split up basically as East, Texas, and West. And a lot of that was just for historic reasons, also, as I said, technical reasons with the phase, but also regulatory reasons. Texas is for many reasons wants to have an independent grid, whereas the West and the East Coast are completely fine having sort of these interstate networks. And then beneath these interconnections are things called RTOs and ISOs. The difference is really mainly that RTOs oversee multiple states. So these are regional transmission entities, whereas ISOs are really just focused on the state level, which allows that more direct regulatory oversight and funding.
Quick note, ISO stands for Independent System Operators, while RTOs are Regional Transmission Organizations. To put it simply, these entities help ensure the grid is reliable. And practically that means balancing the grid, enabling efficient markets, coordinating infrastructure, and more.
A good example is California. California's CalISO is just specifically looking at California, whereas some other RTOs are looking at the entire Northwest region. These balancing authorities, as they're called, essentially operate these wholesale markets. They also operate a lot of the feasibility studies and planning and oversight of the entities involved in those local grids.
Got it. And so when we think about it, there's the interconnections, there's different entities that actually generate the power as well. Mm-hmm. And then there's the market and there's regulation. Maybe you could speak to some of those other buckets and how they fit into the broader mix.
There's deregulated markets and there's regulated markets. So in regulated utilities, essentially, it's top-down controlled by the government. Tennessee Valley Authority is a really famous example. There's a lot of these sort of regulated entities in the Southern United States, like Southern Power Company, or like a lot of these nuclear facilities were built, and a lot of this in sort of the Western United States, spare California. In this case, the power generation, so like the actual power plant, the transmission and distribution lines, and actually interfacing with the end sort of ratepayer customer, all of that is controlled by the government with sort of guaranteed profit margins and things like that. The other type are deregulated markets, which started really becoming a thing over the last 20 or so years, largely pushed forward originally by Enron and pushing these policies of sort of these free markets where energy was going to be traded in these wholesale markets. In these areas, the dominant markets would be California, Texas, the East Coast. There's power generators, people who own the plants. And then oftentimes different companies will own the power lines and be in charge of maintenance and operating the congestion and making sure that the power moves and is delivered. And then there's separate companies that actually interface with the customers. These interfacing, providing like a retail experience to the end ratepayer. So oftentimes these are completely separate different companies. Sometimes they're the same. Sometimes these live like a little bit of a hybrid structure. It all gets very confusing, but it's part of the complexity of the grid that there's very, very different structures depending on where you are.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds complex, and I think there's probably a bunch of misconceptions. I mean, even just the idea that the grid is a monolith is clearly not true. Does anything else jump out there in terms of this idea of public misconception around the grid and how it works and ultimately who runs it, who's getting paid, and how people ultimately get their electricity?
Yeah, I think at a high level, there's like a technical idea of people think that, you plug something into the grid and it's magic. But electricity is not like a commodity. It's certainly not magic. Electricity is generated basically at the moment it's being used. When people say the grid needs to remain balanced, it's measured in terms of frequency. In the United States, it's 60 hertz. In Europe, it's like 50, I believe. And I think in Japan, it's 50 as well. But basically, you need to make sure that the demand for electricity, basically people sucking electricity out of the grid, and then other power generators pushing electricity in, is always the same to maintain that perfect hertz level. And if that ever falters, when people say like the grid is unbalanced, that means it shifts away from that point, in which case a lot of the electrical equipment hooked up to the grid that is calibrated to a specific frequency is damaged. And if things happen too quick, you have to shed load, meaning you have to pull things off. And if you can't do that, then you have blackouts, where essentially equipment's fried and you have to like completely replace it, which could take weeks or months. It can be very dangerous very quickly, as the winter storms in Texas over the last couple of years and the East Coast are make really very clear. And then also the other big point is about sort of this reliability. It's very hard to predict the demand for electricity and the supply of electricity that's going to come in the far future. Most of the time, it's really just looking at weather, and increasingly so as solar and wind become larger portions of our grid. You can assume the sun is going to shine every day, but not always. Like sometimes it can be cloudy and it can decrease the percent. People often say like the wind is always blowing somewhere, but that only matters if you have the transmission lines to move wind from one place to another. So like a nightmare scenario could be you set up a grid with a large portion of wind and it's winter, so everyone has their heaters on, but the wind for some reason is not blowing right as like a cold spell hits. So that's when you have this issue of huge spike in demand, but not enough supply for it. And so there's a bunch of scenario studies that these grid operators will do, trying to figure out like, can we ever guarantee the wind will be blowing in a certain time? And it's really, really hard to do that. So that's why it's so important that, it's not going to be all nuclear, all solar, all wind, or all natural gas, because there are situations where pipes freeze. And so it becomes very, very complex. And it's not as simple as, just connect as much solar as possible. Reliability is a huge issue. In a modern country with our modern luxuries, we can't afford for the grid to go down at all.
That's such a good point, because it really does feel pretty much binary, right? It's not like we want uptime of 95%. It's like we want uptime of 99.9999% or 100, right? Just basically we cannot afford for the grid to go down. And so it does feel like people automatically assume like, let's add more supply. And there are many reasons, it seems like, why that is not such a simple solution. We'll get into the energy mix in a second. But maybe you could just speak to this broad dynamic that you mentioned in your article. That is that the price to generate electricity has come down over the years with new technology, yet the price to actually distribute it or deliver it has gone up. Sounds kind of counterintuitive. Where are things really breaking down there?
Yeah, so I think the most important point to understand here is that when you pay your power bill, for me, PG&E in Northern California, you're paying a combination of prices. You're paying, on one hand, the price of the energy itself, which in deregulated markets is known as like the wholesale price. So this is the price of like the power out the door cost that the power plant is selling the power to these other entities in these power markets. That's one portion of it. And then there's also the cost of the infrastructure and the operational costs of these utilities like PG&E who own the lines and might interface with the customers to deliver that power to you. And so like if you look at your electricity bill, typically they'll separate out these fees, and you can see like many times, and increasingly so in California, the cost to deliver is like over 50% of the bill. It's becoming increasingly high. And the big reason for that is that the infrastructure to build new power lines, to build new power plants is incredibly, incredibly expensive. The interconnection queue is something that people might have heard about before, but basically there's over like 2 terawatts in the queue right now, which means that there's like 2 terawatts of power generating capacity, a nameplate at least, like what it could max out at, waiting to be connected to the grid.
Could you just super quickly ground us on how that compares to how much electricity is on the grid?
I believe our grid today is about 1.2 terawatts. So this is almost effectively double what our current national generating capacity is. So what this shows to me is that it appears like there's a lot of demand for electricity. Now, when you sort of unpack what's going on, there's some interesting, I would say, disincentives of how this queue works, where because of what I mentioned earlier, like the frequency and understanding, grid balancing, there's a lot of feasibility studies that go into, can I put, a gigawatt of power generating capacity here? And then how does that affect the stability of this localized region as well as the broader grid? And these things take a lot of time. And especially when, people are sort of, I want to say, spamming projects where they're, as a company who puts in like 10 proposals of different power plants, waiting to see which ones are going to have the cheapest interconnection fee. Right. And then they'll pull back all the ones that are too expensive and just end up trying to build the one that's the cheapest. But the problem with that is that all these feasibility studies have to run with the idea that all these plants are legitimate. And so this has created this massive queue of maybe, I think it's like 10 to 20% of projects are actually built.
That's wild.
It's crazy. There's a lot of really interesting new policy coming from the federal level about how to manage these queues. Texas famously has a way that they handle it. They call it, I believe, connect and manage. If anyone has been paying attention to the electric grid recently, they'll know Texas has been able to connect a lot of assets. But instead of running these feasibility studies, they'll basically, levy that risk of connection to the developer and say, you can connect your solar or wind anywhere, but if it at all risks our grid, we're going to cut you off. Whereas in California or other places, they're like, we want to make sure it's always going to be delivering power and it's not going to, destabilize our connection. So there's a lot of ways to handle this, but that makes it, any sort of new construction very, very difficult. But the success of Texas and how much wind and solar and batteries they've been able to connect and why a lot of companies are flooding there is because of this policy that makes it very, very easy to connect new assets.
Now, if you didn't catch that, basically what Ryan is saying is that ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, is flipping the incentive. So instead of the onus being on them to prove that a project can work, it's on the developer to make that a reality. And of course, if they don't, there are consequences. But there are other approaches being explored in tandem.
There are also interesting ways through FERC, which is a national body overseeing this, of trying to bundle up different projects, providing sort of fees. So instead of like being able to sort of just, YOLO projects in, you are now sort of taking on some sort of financial risk by putting in fake projects. So trying to disincentivize doing that. But even if you can get these projects approved, things like transformers are, have crazy lead times, like over a year or more, not to mention that it's increased in price dramatically. If you're trying to build out like a new sort of housing project or something like that, and you have to build like sort of a substation, securing these things is also a huge problem, which are just additional things to worry about. Both cybersecurity and physical security. I think over the last couple of years, people have been shooting substations and it takes down like a local grid. There's very little you can do there besides just paying somebody to just be on site and securing that. Perhaps lastly, like just the existing power lines, the PG&E fires that people might have seen in Northern California. I believe Camp Fire was one of them. But some of these lines were built in the early 1900s. I was up hiking at Muir Woods the other week, and if you're up at the top of the hill, you can see these transmission lines that are going through, and there's trucks that will go and manually check a lot of them. Mm-hmm. If one of these lines falls over dry grass, like it's likely going to start a fire, and that's what we continue to see, especially if they're that old. And when something like that happens, they don't know where the line actually fell. They know like on what type of power line it fell, but not specifically the spot. So it actually often takes trucks driving through to see where these damages occur. So there are a lot of interesting like potential upgrades that need to be done. And all of this just ends up being, sort of pushed onto the consumer.
That's so interesting. I did not realize they can't actually tell where things are breaking down at the local level. So I've heard a few things. You mentioned that the actual queue is increasing in terms of adding more power. I'm also hearing things maybe around supply chain, security. Is there anything else you'd mention in terms of just the overall set of challenges that exist as we're trying to improve this grid?
Yeah, I mean, I think this rise of intermittent power it introduces a lot of complexity, and not just intermittent power, but where the power is generated. I think one of the big theses we have is that there's going to be a decentralization of the grid. Now, it's not like we're going to start taking offline all of our large power plants, but as the demand for energy is increasing, it's going to become easier for people to generate power on site. Solar is going to be the big reason for that, but also battery storage. And as I mentioned earlier, people are going to have electric vehicles that can store energy and connect to their house. Your stove is going to have a battery likely. Your heating might actually have some energy storage capabilities as well. That power is going to be flowing in many different directions, which is very different from a world where power is generated at a big plant and just going in one direction. So people need to rethink how grid infrastructure works and functions. It is not as simple as just pressing the button and the power going backwards.
Totally.
So that's something that the grid operators are thinking about as well.
Yeah, that sounds really important. And maybe at the crux of us needing to distribute more of the grid is this idea that a lot of our new sources, as you're saying, are more of that intermittent type. So we're talking a lot of renewables. So maybe we can just start there and address the question, which is why are renewables alone not enough, especially as we increase the capacity of solar and wind? You spoke a little bit to this, but maybe you could just break that down explicitly.
Renewables, I want to be clear, renewables are fantastic. They are cheaper. Even without subsidies, LCOE is often a metric thrown around, which is the levelized cost of energy. Solar and wind are really, really good. The problem is that you cannot guarantee that they're going to be available when you need it. And it's often the case that, for example, if you look at the demand profile for energy in any sort of modernized economy. It's typically in the early mornings, everyone's waking up and the energy use is high. And then there's a trough in the middle of the day, which is right when it's sunny, when the solar panels are generating the most electricity. And then there's a huge spike in the evening when everyone comes home, turns on their TV, starts cooking dinner. And there's a drop as well later into the middle of the night. So the problem with this, obviously, and this is a phenomenon known as also as the duck curve, if people are familiar with that. But basically, the middle of the day, when energy is essentially free, when the sun is blaring, and energy is really, really cheap, but the demand is at its lowest point. So you need to find a way to capture that energy in the middle of the day and have it available in the evenings when the sun is not shining or when it's dusk. Mm-hmm. And then similarly, it's something like wind. You cannot guarantee that wind is going to be blowing. You can look at trends to have this idea of wind's going to be blowing, and generally at night it's windier. But this is really, really hard for operators to rely on. So this is why energy storage is so critical. You're doing intermittent sources, you need some way to sort of level it out. So operators know that, we're going to have enough energy when we need it. And this is coming from a world where we used to have natural gas plants that could chug along 24/7. Same with nuclear, which is, these are things that are base load. Geothermal is another one. Previously in our country, almost all of our energy storage, I think it's like 90+% today, is through hydro, through dams. So when there's a shortfall at all, we would just sort of open the floodgates a little bit on the dams, and water would trickle through and be able to make up smaller changes in energy fluctuation or major ones. And so if we're going to increase the amount of solar and wind on the grid, we also need to proportionally increase the amount of storage. And this is going to be a very significant challenge.
Yeah, to your point, it sounds like we need some balancing mechanism. We'll talk about natural gas and nuclear in a second, but let's speak directly to batteries. Something that I found really fascinating from your article is the point you just made about hydro. Like, when I think about storage, and many people think about storage, they automatically think of batteries. And this table says that only 2% of our US storage in 2022 actually came from lithium-ion batteries, which was surprising to me, and 94% from pumped hydro. Like, that's totally, talk about misconceptions from earlier. I did not know that in any capacity. And so can you just speak to, where we are today and the storage demand, whether that comes from battery or otherwise? How do we get to where we need to be? Is it just a matter of creating a bunch more batteries or hydro capacity? Is this all really feasible to do in the next few years?
Yeah, so it's difficult to make projections here because a lot of this comes down to the cost of batteries.
Yeah.
If batteries are, $10, $30 a kilowatt hour, then a lot of this stuff becomes meaningless. Obviously, there's critical mineral concerns about where we access this stuff. This newer generation of batteries that are less energy dense, like sodium ion, becomes less of a concern. Regardless, that's going to be sort of the key thing to pay attention to. What I will say is in the near term, batteries have already sort of dominated this very, very short time frame markets. So I mentioned these wholesale markets earlier, but they're sort of structured in different time durations. So depending on how quick you need to supply energy. So I mentioned sort of the fact that you need to maintain a certain frequency. There's a market that's called broadly ancillary services, which is really just focusing on power quality. So if it moves from 60 hertz a little bit, the grid will sort of seek more energy or less energy to balance it out. Batteries already dominate that because they're very, very good at moving very, very fast, but it's a very, very small amount of energy. Increasingly, as batteries enter the grid, which as you've noted from the chart, it's not that significant penetration yet. They will start to be able to cycle over sort of a daily time frame. So as I mentioned earlier, taking energy from the middle of the day and allowing its use in the evenings when people actually need it.
If you didn't catch that, batteries currently only cycle from minutes to hours. But the hope is that their storage duration will become hours to days, just like hydro, which composes the lion's share of US current storage capacity.
Now, the problem with batteries is they can't solve these sort of longer duration spells. So I mentioned this case where if your grid has a huge wind component, it might be not windy for weeks. Unlikely, but it's possible. Batteries are not very good at storing energy for long periods of time. When I say long, days or weeks. You'll need alternative methods of storing that energy. there are a lot of things proposed, a lot of companies trying novel solutions like synthetic natural gas or hydrogen. There's gravity batteries, there's sort of iron air batteries, a bunch of different ways to do this. But these are essentially trying to do almost weeks to months to seasonal storage. And that's also going to be a component as well that I'm excited to see continue to build out. Batteries in the energy sense, but not the same batteries you'd see in cars.
And then let's jump to natural gas and nuclear, which are two other, you could say, balancing mechanisms that have been used in different capacities in different places. They have their pros and cons. Just tell me a little bit more about where natural gas and nuclear currently play a role, and then also the potential for them to play a different role.
So natural gas is dominant on our grid. The United States is a major natural gas producer. Fracking was huge for this country in terms of energy independence. Today, there are sort of two different types of natural gas plants. There's some that are running 24/7. And there's some plants called peaker plants that essentially, if there's a shortfall or if there's no other sort of generating capacity, peaker plants were bid to fulfill that gap. And it's more expensive. Let's say you're building a natural gas plant. You can amortize it 24/7, and it's going to be cheaper to run that power plant as opposed to, some of these peaker plants might run at a 1% capacity factor, which is effectively, 1% of the time that they could be running. And those are going to be way more expensive to generate that power, but it'd probably be cheaper than using solar and storing it in batteries today. Now, natural gas is also good because you don't really rely on the weather, so you can always sort of turn it on. And you can typically ramp it up pretty quickly. There's a lot of benefits there as well. Also, I would note that the sort of relationship between natural gas and nuclear is sort of a historic one. Natural gas was sort of, I don't want to say the reason that nuclear found a lot of competition, but like from a price point, as we sort of looked at nuclear in the late 20th century, it was the same time that natural gas became very big.
Interesting.
And natural gas quickly became very, very cheap, and nuclear became very expensive. So natural gas became a very big piece of our grid and will likely continue to be a major piece of our grid as long as our domestic production continues and there's no sort of radical change in energy source. Now, if we can make nuclear fission incredibly cheap, if we can have nuclear fusion become incredibly cheap, then a lot of this need for dispatchable or ready-to-go energy sources will change. But until then, natural gas will probably remain a significant piece of our grid because it is reliable.
We've been working on nuclear for decades, right? And it would be surprising. I know there's a long charted history of what's happened in those decades, but it does seem like even just purely from the technological perspective, we have new reactor designs coming online or at least being developed, and maybe in a new renaissance of public discourse around it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing to understand for nuclear, particularly the historic nuclear, which are these gigawatt scale power plants, the newest of which the designs with AP1000, this is Vogtle, this is Southern Power Company, that is a regulated utility that saw a lot of government support to build this. In fact, the local companies, a lot of times when people are building nuclear power plants, the utilities will go out of business. The government needs to sort of step in to help them. It's been a really, really difficult journey for utilities to buy large nuclear power plants. So I think that's the primary reason you haven't seen it done. And those who have tried, like Vogtle, you see these sort of horrible cost increases and a lot of problems. And I think I go into that in detail in my essay of what those causes are. But it is sort of rational. Like, why would a utility risk bankruptcy? Or even more so, like, I don't know when the power plant is going to be up. Is it going to be 10 years? Is it going to be 20 years? You don't really know. And so it's really hard to make that, $10 billion bet. So that's why it's very, very hard for especially deregulated utilities. It really takes a government, which is why nationally, look at Japan and France, and even, like I said, our regulated utilities in the United States, a lot of our nuclear power plants are, government supported. It's very, very hard to take on that risk as a private entity. Now, the future of nuclear, I think what we're seeing is the rise of SMRs and smaller reactors. I think the reliability of power, I think, is going to become increasingly relevant for a lot of people. You could see, in the news, you've seen Microsoft and some of the other hyperscalers talk about, we want to do nuclear powered data centers. We want to have access to clean energy that is available 24/7. Now, you could achieve this with a large solar farm and batteries. You could do it with geothermal, which, some of these hyperscalers are also looking at. But nuclear is one of the most compelling. If you're one of these data centers, you want to ensure reliability. You want something that you plug it in, it's going to last 15, 20 years. And nuclear sort of uniquely provides that. In terms of this decentralization trend, solar and batteries are going to be a piece of it residentially and perhaps like these local communities. But it's likely that, these off the grid or incredibly, this focus on reliability over sort of cost, nuclear is going to be a very compelling option. Now, all that's to say that we solve some of the, the issues on the regulatory side and some of these new designs get approved and built.
Since we're on the topic of policy, does anything jump out at you in terms of where policy can help kind of usher this new grid forward, or to kind of help solve some of the gaps that we just talked about in terms of like the interconnection queue or the different energy mix that we're discussing?
FERC is sort of like the federal body that oversees a lot of the transmission and distribution and grid infrastructure. The stuff I've read, at least, seems very positive. People are aware of a lot of these issues. And there's a separate group called the NERC, which is a semi sort of government associated, but they run these sort of these risk reports. And they have highlighted that one of the key risks for the grid over the next decade is actually policy. So a lot of people will say things like, we need to go completely renewable. We need to be completely solar and wind expeditiously. The problem with that is, as I said, like the reliability concerns, it's going to create a lot of issues. But I think when we think about, what are our climate goals? Like these are human goals. Like we want to live in a better world. That better world near term is not a world with increased blackouts. There are a lot of countries that were once had great grids. South Africa, great example. They have nuclear power, but much of the day in South Africa, the grid is actually completely down.
Really?
So dysfunction from a policy perspective, there are worlds where it can revert. And the reliability that a country once had disappears. Now, I don't think it will get that bad in the United States, but there are a lot of interesting warning signs, and people in utilities and people who have been in the power industry for a long time are beginning to speak up. The last thing I'll mention is the IRA. So the Inflation Reduction Act put a lot of policies forth for energy. So a lot of companies, for example, batteries, manufacturing credits, various incentives to both sort of bring onshore a lot of this production, also make available a lot of funding for grid enhancement, both locally and sort of regionally. So there's a lot of funding available for this, which is very exciting. And so a lot of the things that need to be done, it seems like, are beginning to happen. So I'm optimistic.
All right, that is your call to build. Clearly, the grid is no monolith, and solutions can't stand alone. They need to be thoughtfully interwoven into the matrix of an already complex energy mix. Dated infrastructure, changing regulation, and more. But another area that is prime for opportunity is applying technology to the grid. Despite a multi-decade wave of software eating the world, it seems like the grid hasn't quite held pace. And if you'd like to hear Ryan's take on the possibility of a smart and decentralized grid, we have the extended version of this episode live on our podcast feed. You can check that out at a16z.com/electricgrid for more. And be sure to check out the links in our description for 2 articles from Ryan that break down the electric grid and nuclear energy even more deeply. And with that, we will see you next time.